Section 4 of the purchase contract, disclosures, or where the seller gets sued. So, Section 4, disclosures, is where the seller is signing off and contractually obligating themselves to tell things about the property that the buyer needs to know about the property. So this one I'm actually going to do backwards. Right, we're going to start at the end of it. All right, down here at Section 4F, paragraph 4F, changes during escrow. All right, the seller's going to notify the buyer if anything happens to the property while they're under contract. If there is a break-in, if anything is damaged, if there's suddenly a mechanic's lien put on the property, anything that the seller is aware of, the seller is obligated to tell the buyer, and the buyer has 5 days to disapprove to the seller. And every time you see in the contract it says notice of disapproval to seller, that's the buyer has an option to pull out of the contract at that point and get their earnest money back. If there's a lot of times that the property is unoccupied. Oh, client I have not heard from in a while. So a lot of times the property is unoccupied. Sometimes the seller is moved out of state, but still when something comes up, all right, the seller is obligated to tell the buyer, hey, this just happened to the property. How do you want to proceed? All right. Next line above that is Section 4E, affidavit of disclosure. And affidavit of disclosure happens if you're in an unincorporated area of the county, out in the sticks, basically. It's a separate document that is going to discuss things where you'll be disclosing where's the water coming from, how are we dealing with the sewer system. That's a requirement in there. But if you're in a city, Peoria, Phoenix, Glendale, wherever, an affidavit of disclosure is not going to be required. Line above that, section above that, is the lead-based paint disclosure. Now, this is a big thing. This started out many years ago, that when they discovered that lead-based paint was an issue, especially for the development of children, they banned the use of lead paint back in 1978. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that lead paint stopped being used at that time period. It's just they couldn't make it anymore. So you should always be a little aware when you're sitting there in 1979 built house or something that it might actually have lead-based paint that was used in there. All right. The seller is going to disclose that using a separate form called the lead-based paint disclosure. And then the seller is going to, at that point, say, just going down the list, whether or not they know of any lead-based paint in the house. All right. If they've ever received a risk assessment or inspector of the premise, all right, and the seller has a copy of that, they're going to be delivering that. They're going to provide the buyer with the actual disclosure of information and reports, records, pamphlets, anything else that's ever been told about lead-based paint in the house, including the pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, collectively lead-based paint information. This is a document that's put out by HUD. I hand it to every one of my buyers right at the very beginning. Technically, this is a seller requirement because it's called out right there that the seller is going to be doing that. But 9 times out of 10, this is something that the lender actually does, especially on FHA loans. But it's a little document talking about lead-based paint, the impacts it can have, what you can do to mitigate it if you think you have lead-based paint. Long story short, it just breaks down to don't lick the walls and don't eat the paint chips. Right, but buyers need to have a copy of that. All right, and then the buyer is going to initial and sign that they've gotten this document, this lead-based paint disclosure. In fact, I'm going to do you guys one better. Let's just pull one up here real quick. What would they call that? It's probably going to be under residential. See, this is why I don't do these things on the fly like this. Disclosure in election, referral fee, income. Disclosure of information, lead-based paint. Let's just take a look at this real quick. So this document is actually filled out. Now, this one in particular is for rental properties, right? But, so let me go back and get the real one. Completely editing this. Okay, so this is a seller's disclosure for lead-based paint. All right. The seller fills this out first. This is something that good agents will have the seller do at the same time they're doing the listing documentation. They will put it into the MLS, into the Documents tab. So you, the buyer, and the buyer's agent could pull this down and already sign it and already initial it and send it over to the other side. All right. And Section 1 is whether or not they have knowledge or they don't have knowledge. And the seller initials on that one. All right. And if there are any records available, that they've disclosed that to it, or there are no reports. Seller initials that. All right. And the seller is also acknowledging the fact that the buyer gets a chance to do an inspection if they want to at the buyer's expense, to have a professional come in there, scrape the walls, test the paint, and say whether or not it is lead-based paint or not. Then the buyer, after they've received this from the seller, gets to initial themselves. And the first one is, I'm initialing, I read it. And then, yes, I did get a copy of Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, the one I was telling you about. And they're also clarifying whether or not they have received an inspection period to do the test, or they're waiving that inspection period to do that test. And then the third part of this thing is where the real estate agents, like the only document in all of this thing, is the real estate agents themselves initial and sign, all right, to say that we have assured the seller's compliance and done all of this. So cooperating agent, listing agent, everybody signs on that. So that's a lead-based paint. It's just seller tells the buyer what they know about it. Buyer understands I have the opportunity right now to go and decide whether or not I want to actually continue on with this process and do my own inspection. So, and let's bounce back out. So we're going back to the purchase contract over here. And on our purchase contract, down in Section 4, we've just completed lead-based paint. All right, paragraph 4C, this is foreign sellers. Now, there's a law in the United States of America. All right, it's called the Foreign Investment and Real Property Trust Act. Right, this is what happens when you have a foreign owner of the property, like a Canadian or Chinese, whatever, Englishman, somebody who is not a U.S. citizen. If a foreign person, a non-citizen of the United States of America, is selling American property, the buyer, hear this out, this is fun. All right, the seller has to disclose whether or not they are, because the buyer is ultimately responsible for making sure that up to 15% of the purchase price is withheld for potential income tax from the seller. Now, that sounds really weird, because you're going, hey, why does the buyer have to worry about the seller's income tax? And ultimately is because if for some reason the seller moves out of country, it's really hard to track them down if they're in Uzbekistan. So this is sort of like, think of it as like a contractual lien on the property. This is the IRS coming in there and saying, yeah, well, we still get owed money from somebody. And so since you, Mr. Buyer, are here in the States, we'll go after you for it. So, and you actually will find this down in, scroll. Conversation, risk of loss. Oh, right down here in Section 6N. We're going to be seeing this again, later on in another video. But this is the point: a buyer of residential property must withhold federal income taxes up to 15% of the purchase price. Now, in reality, escrow does that all for you. Escrow is going to sit there and decide and research to see if the seller is a U.S. citizen or a foreign national, and if money does need to be withheld, the escrow is going to withhold that. But that's that little phrase right in there. We want to make sure that's called out in the contract. All right, going up, and now we're starting to get into the more meat of the disclosure side of it. All right, the insurance claim history. Seller needs to tell the buyer within 5 days contract, going under contract, of the property going under contract. Give them a record of any insurance claims made on the property within the last 5 years, or the length of time that the seller has owned the property, if less than 5 years. What this does is this allows the buyer to understand, okay, yeah, there was a claim on the roof. In fact, there was 2 claims on the roof. In fact, there's been a claim on the roof every year for the last 5 years, right? The seller needs to disclose on that. It is as simple as the seller calls up their insurance company and says, I need a claims history for the last 5 years. And this gets screwed up all the time. Usually when a seller calls the 1-800 number and they got some phone person working out of a call center who does not have a good frequently asked questions list and doesn't know how to provide that. And they'll say, oh, we don't know what that is, or we don't provide this. No, every insurance company does provide that. It's just getting a hold of somebody who actually knows what you're talking about. I've had to, on the seller's behalf, call up, go through the entire chain, waiting 5 minutes, listening to hold music, press pound for, talk to an operator, figure out what, find a person who can do it. And since I can't do it for my seller, all right, write down the instructions of you're going to hit 1, you're going to wait, you're going to hit 2, you're going to hit pound 3, to get back to that person to ask for that information, right? If this, however, in the business, this is called a clue report. However, it is not a clue report. We should not be using the term a clue report because a clue report is something completely different. A clue report is an insurance claim history on an individual and any insurance policy associated with them. We are only looking at the claims history for the property for the last 5 years. And if you've switched between multiple insurance companies, you need to get multiple insurance companies to send you their insurance claims history for the period of time, of the last 5 years to say whether or not claims have been made. So if it is unavailable from these sources, all right, the seller may within 5 days after contract acceptance, the buyer shall provide, where is that right there? Buyer shall written a written 5-year insurance claim history regarding the premises for a claims history for the length of time sellers own the property less than 5 years from the seller's insurance company or an insurance support organization or consumer reporting agency, or if unavailable from these sources, from the seller. So the seller can actually just write on a piece of paper, I have had no insurance claims in the last 5 years, if you cannot get it from one of these other organizations. Now, just so you know, you will see that consumer reporting agency in there as an option. It actually takes 3 weeks. So if you can't get the insurance claim history up front, early on, this is something you really want to tell people right at when you're signing contract, the listing, signing with your listing agreement before you even put it on the market. You have them call that up and get that thing working if they have to go through a consumer reporting agency. I just did this a couple months ago just to see how long it took, and it was literally 3 weeks before it showed up, and I had to log into a system, prove that I was who I was by asking, answering questions like what was the color of my first car, what was the bank loan I had on my first car, that kind of stuff. And then they'll send that thing out. So once again, if you're actually working through an insurance broker and stuff like that, this is really easy. You call them and say, hey, I need a claims history, you get it, right? Now, the next part, the first part actually in the contract. All right, let me break down what this entire section does. All right, and this is, I use the term, this is where the seller gets sued, because historically the majority of times people are suing the seller, it is because they did not disclose something they were supposed to. Now, there's a difference between legally obligated and contractually obligated. Right? Legally, a legal obligation is that the state of Arizona has stated, has codified in law, the seller will say to the buyer the information that they have in their head about something. Right? It needs to be disclosed. Right? Contractually means it's an obligation that has to be performed because you signed a contract. You can sign you do not have to use this contract right here. You do not need to go to a real estate agent, all right, list your house, get your house, buyers into your house, have a buyer make an offer on the Arizona Association of Realtors, sales contract. You don't actually have to do that here in Arizona. Right? You can go down to Office Max, and there's a big board over in the corner. It's a wireframe thing, and there are contracts in there that you can pull off. They're all boilerplate. You can handwrite in the address. You can handwrite in everything, and you can send this over to the seller, and the seller can accept it, and it will close just like any other contract will. Now, that does not mean that if you go that route, you don't have to tell people about the meth lab in your basement, because that is a legal obligation you have. Right? So there are legal things that the seller has to say to make your life easier, to make everybody's life easier. The association, AR, has come up with something called the Seller's Property Disclosure Statement. We call it the SPUDS. All right? And the seller is going to deliver a completed AR residential SPUDS form to the buyer within 3 days, 1, 2, 3, after contract's acceptance. And the buyer shall provide notice of any items disapproved within the inspection period or 5 days after the receipt of the SPUDS, whichever is later. So the SPUDS, let's go to that document right here. Okay, now, looks like this. And the first thing you see, remember what I said a couple videos ago. When it is in bold, it is yelling at you. When it is bold and underlined, it is screaming at you. All right? When in doubt, disclose. This document was created by the Arizona Association of Realtors to make the seller's life easier in fulfilling their legal obligations to the buyer. Have I hammered this home enough? So the reason why I hammer this so hard is because back in 08, 09, right, there was a lot of bank-owned properties. And those banks were located in states that were not Arizona. And those non-Arizona banks had non-Arizona attorneys who thought they were smarter than everybody else, and just would simply state when they had a listing over here, you ain't getting a SPUDS. We want the buyer to acknowledge that you're not getting a SPUDS. We're not sending you a residential seller disclosure advisory form because we have too many properties and we can't fill one out for each and every property. That did not relieve them of the obligation to disclose what they knew about the property. And they knew stuff about the property because they would have had agents inside the property going through to advise them on the pricing. There were things that they would have walked through and noticed. They would have known things like the property address. But these attorneys for these banks who are not in Arizona decided it was okay. Oh, we're just going to say buyer's going to waive the SPUDS. Problem with that is that they would go down as part of the contract and they would write in there, buyer must waive the SPUDS. The buyers must waive the residential seller disclosure advisory. And that's completely okay. That is waiving the mechanism to deliver the information that they are legally obligated to disclose. And I guarantee you, many of these banks knew things about the property that they did not disclose to the buyers at the end of these, and these buyers bought properties and paid money of a certain value based on the assumption that the house was in a certain condition when the seller knew that the house was not in that condition. That's a lawsuit. Anybody who wants to retire, any young attorneys out there in the world who wants to retire, this is your class action suit. Right? This will get you out of there. I've had the same conversation for the last 8 years. I have yet to hear the class action suit kick off. It'll be a lot of fun. I will giggle. You will see me giggle. All right. But this is the document where the seller gets to tell you everything about the property. Now, the one thing people do not understand is you do not get in trouble for not knowing something. Right? Ignorance is a defense. If you've never knocked a hole in the wall and you never knew that it was, lead pipes in the wall, you cannot get in trouble for never telling anybody about the lead pipes you did not know about. Right? Where you get in trouble is when you don't do that. Right? And this is a conversation I have with every one of my listers, every seller. All right, is you never get in trouble for not saying saying I don't know. All right, I don't know is an acceptable answer in real estate. So once again, bold, underlined. If you do not make the legally required disclosures, you may be subject to civil liability. Right? These are important things. This entire document is here, right, to help the seller fulfill their legal obligations. Now, here's the other thing. For sale by owner. Right? You see those signs, for sale by owner. I have talked to people who are selling their house who are for sale by owners because they used to be a really great way to get listings. And they've told me straight out, I can't use a real estate agent. Well, why can't you use a real estate agent? There's things about this house that I know that I'll have to disclose if I'm using a real estate agent. Wrong answer, asshole. All right? You still have to disclose that, but since you're not using a real estate agent, you didn't have somebody tell you still have to disclose that. That's still a lawsuit if the buyer finds out that you knew and that you did not tell them. Right. This is a recurring thing. We teach these classes. We have to go to these classes. We hear the great stories about nobody ever told the buyer that the air conditioner was shot. The buyer buys a house. Spring comes around. The air conditioner doesn't work. They call the one air conditioning company in the county, and the guy comes out and says, "Yeah, I was expecting you to call me. I have to be out here every year to try to get this thing going." Oh, is it a problem? Yeah, it needs to be replaced 5 years ago. I've been telling Bobby over there, who sold this place to you, that it needs to be replaced, for the last 5 years, and he kept saying no. Guess what? Bobby gets a lawsuit. All right. So I hope I'm stressed out enough on this thing. I hope I got this point across to you guys that this is an important document. This is the seller's obligation. We'll go through it really quick, but there's one more paragraph on here that I really need to point out, and you will see this on about 3 different documents. Right? There is an asterisk here. All right. By law, sellers are not obligated. This is something that a seller is not obligated to disclose. These are called out. All right. That the property is or has been the site of a natural death, suicide, homicide, or any other crimes classified as a felony. Meth labs are the exception. All right. Owned or occupied by a person exposed to HIV or diagnosed as having AIDS or any other disease not known to be transmitted through common occupancy of real estate. Be really interesting if we have a COVID suit come out on this thing where somebody died who had COVID, because we don't know whether or not that's been transmitted through common occupancy of real estate, all right, or located in the vicinity of a sex offender. However, the law does not protect a seller who makes an intentional misrepresentation. All right. For example, if you were asked if there's been a death on property and you know that there was such a death, you should not answer no or I don't know. Instead, you should either answer truthfully or respond that you are not legally required to answer the question. All right. 2 things on this one. Right? This has been changed. All right. The line, however, the law does not protect a seller who makes an intentional misrepresentation, was a lawsuit that happened about six years or so ago. It was a local attorney who was moving, and he was moving because a sex offender had moved right next door to him. For some reason or another, the seller wound up meeting the buyer face to face, and the buyer asked him, "Well, why are you selling?" And the seller said, "We want to move to this suburb over there to be closer to friends." Later on, after the buyer moved in, buyer talking with other neighbors discovered the sex offender next door and discovered that the reason why the seller had stated he was moving to everybody but the buyer was because of the sex offender. It went to court. Mr. Attorney Seller defended himself, saying, because of this line right here, I do not need to disclose. I did not have an obligation to disclose. And the court spanked him and said, yeah, but you also have an obligation not to lie. So that's why we have that little phrase in there, right? Now, the reason why these 3 things exist is something called stigmatized property law. What stigmatized property is people are afraid, and this really kicked off back during the AIDS crisis of the 80s, that nobody knew what AIDS was. Nobody knew how you got it, right? You knew it was as a death sentence because we didn't have the drugs that we have now. So people would die of AIDS, and people would be afraid to move into that house because they weren't sure if the AIDS germs were still floating around, and would give it to them. And so that would create what's called stigmatized property, and the property itself would lose its value because nobody would want to buy it. And sellers were afraid, landlords were afraid of renting out to people with AIDS because it could stigmatize their property. So they passed this law in here, and that says, natural death, suicide, or homicide, or any other crimes classified as a felony, right? Owned or occupied by a person with AIDS, cover that. And then the third one was located in the vicinity of a sex offender, because there was some drawback of if the sex offender moves in next door to you and you suddenly have to disclose to everybody, the entire block, the entire street, the entire subdivision could go down because of Chester the molester next door. So something else where they came out where they do not have to disclose that. But if they are directly asked, all right, they need to answer no, or I don't know, or I do not legally required to answer the question. All right, that's how that works out. Now, once again, if you don't know the next door neighbor is a sex offender, you do not get in trouble for saying I don't know. All right, if you honestly don't know. So let's just go over a couple of these things on here. A lot more writings. This is something that the seller needs to fill out themselves. This is not something that the agent should be filling out for them. All right, seller fills these things out in hand by themselves. All right, you do. Little note to real estate agents out there: your broker will not allow you to fill this out. If your broker is allowing to fill this out, have your broker call the E&O insurance company and see if that's a good idea. Because this is the seller's representation. It should not be interpreted by anybody or handwritten down. Right? It's going to have simple stuff. Property address. Is there any leased land? Who's the current owners of the property? How long have you had it? All right. These are things that the bank supposedly did not have the information to give over to people. Now, when the bank started playing that game, let's go back to my little mini rant we had earlier. When the bank started playing that no spuds game, other people thought that was a pretty clever idea, especially landlords. So the landlords started doing hey, I've never lived in the property. I don't know anything about the property. I can't give you a spuds. And that was a really, really bad policy on their part, and their agents should have gotten in front of that and said, no, you're putting yourself at risk here. Because all I have to do is show, if I'm on the buyer's side attorney, all I have to do is pull up a blank document to show this to the jury and say, the seller, Mr. Landlord here, didn't know his property address. Or maybe he was actually trying to hide information that he actually knew. All right, so then we started getting landlords doing that. So, and then once people saw landlords doing it, regular homeowners thought it was a great idea. All right, or even people, it's like, mom and dad just, dad just died. We got the house. We have to sell it. We're not going to do a spuds at all. There is still stuff you're going to know. Always disclose. Right? And if it's second or third hand information, you can write down, I heard from my father that. Right? Disclose. All right? Property address, legal on. We go through, we got other stuff. Is there an HOA? Everybody knows if there's an HOA. Do you know what the fees are if you know what they are? Or you say, I don't know. All right? You should. Are you aware of any judgments, tax liens? All right? Are you aware if there's any special assessments coming down? Any easements that's coming down? Trust me, a bank will know if there's any easements on the property because they got a copy of the title report, no matter what they said. Right? Is there any maintenance? Things going on. Are you aware if there's any past roof leaks? And it just goes down. Now, a lot of people, it's like, I can't remember what year that was. I had a roof leak. I think it was 2017 or maybe it was 2018. Write that down in there. You don't get in trouble for being vague. Right? Call it out. Are you aware if there's any termites? All right? Yes. I had them treated. That's all you got to say. All right? Heating and cooling. All right? Heating. I have an gas pack on my roof. Approximate age, don't know it was there when I bought it. Or, yeah, replace that in 2019. Same with cooling. Do you have air conditioning? Yes. How long has it been there? Don't know. It was there when I bought it. Right. Plumbing, water heater types, any treatment systems. We're going through. We're talking about, is there a pool? All right, is it heated? Has there been any problems with it? Miscellaneous stuff. Now, this is where we get fun, okay? Are you aware of any animals or pets that have resided in the property? All right, yes, what kind? I've seen everything. I've seen, tarantulas, all the way up to dogs to horses. All right. Now, right here, are you aware or have you observed any of the following on the property? Scorpions, rabid animals, bee swarms, rodents, reptiles, bed bugs, or others. All right. That used to say venomous reptiles. All right. Now it's any reptiles. Yeah, I've seen, geckos. I've seen lizards. Right. You don't have to give them the scientific name for the common Arizona gecko. Right? But you do have to call these things out. Right? Now, under the other, telling you another story. Once upon a time, some Californians moved to Arizona. Right? Two nice married couple and their little dog Fluffy. And they bought a lovely place out in Hampton. It was right there on the edge of the desert. And as they walked out in the backyard, they'd sit there and there's this little game trail through their backyard. Right? It was gorgeous, right? Like the desert can be. So they buy the house, love the house. First morning, they open up that back door to enjoy the backyard, right? And watch the sun come up over the mountains. And little Fluffy goes running out there onto the game trail directly into the pack of javelina, right? And little Fluffy got exploded by a pack of javelina. So, sounds horrible, right? Buyers, right, mourning for Fluffy, sued the seller for not disclosing the pack of javelina that made the game trail, that went up and down the game trail every morning. Now, do you see javelina listed here on line 40? No. Right. But the seller still lost the suit. Right? And the judge found that the seller should have disclosed that there was a pack of javelina moving up and down. And if you sit there and you tell a Californian, yeah, we got javelina and they run up and down the trail, and Californians don't know what javelinas are, and they still let Fluffy loose in the morning, well, you're covered, right? Because it's sort of their obligation to go, wow, javelinas are mean little bastards when they get going in the morning. So, things you need to disclose. I've had a client disclose a Gila monster. Lives right across the street from me, right? I asked about venomous reptiles and all this shit. I saw this really big orange and black lizard once. I pulled out my phone and I looked up Gila monster and I showed her a picture of it and I said, did it look like that? She goes, oh yeah, it looked exactly like that. And I said, write down Gila monster. Right. So that's what this thing is for. Let people know. If you're having your servicing, you're not going to scare the seller off. Explaining, oh yeah, we have scorpions. Because trust me, everybody should know we have scorpions. Right? What you want to say is like, yeah, I saw a scorpion. I saw it 2 years ago. What did we do? I got the place serviced. Haven't seen a scorpion since. That's all you need to say. So, now, as we come down here, there's other stuff like, have you done any conversions? Have you done any work? Was there any permits required? Do you still have the permits? All right. There's a conversation in one of the last disclosure classes I was in that if you are flipping a house, if you're doing any work on the house, you should always, always, always have a copy of the work permits, and you need to be disclosing what the contractor's license number was. Right? So start collecting that stuff up. So it's like, oh, we're going to demo and remodel the kitchen. Start collecting that. You're going to want to disclose, yeah, I used Mike over here, and here's his license number. So carries out. And other stuff. Utilities are on here. Where the post office box is. Does the postman come to your property? Does he go to the mailbox down in the corner? Do you have to pick it up over there? Right? All these things. And then at the end of the day, right, you get this little second additional explanations. If there's anything else that you can think of, right, that would have been a really good place to write. Oh, by the way, javelinas. All right, that would be a really good place to to write down, anything else that you think might. This is your CYA moment. This is where you get to come clean on the property. And 9 times out of 100, the buyers are not going to care about your Gila monster. But you still want to write that thing down on there. Now, after that, seller's going to sign. All right. The buyers acknowledge receipt. All right. They're going to acknowledge the receipt. They're also going to acknowledge the exact same thing that we just talked about with the natural death, suicides, AIDS, and sex offenders and whatnot, that the seller's not obligated to disclose that. So, and then they're going to sign off on that they received it. They have a period of time stated in the contract to say, hey, you know what? I can't live in a house with a Gila monster. And then they can pull out. So this is the spuds. This is a really, really big document that is more important than people look at. They don't spend a lot of time on it. Very, very rarely have I ever seen a buyer come in there and sometimes, and go, oh my God, I did not know that the roof needed to be replaced or that the roof had worked on. All right. In fact, I can't think of one buyer actually punched out because of the spuds. Really cannot come up with one big one where it's like, oh wow, did not realize that it wasn't going already. If they had an issue, we were actually looking for that issue before we moved, before we wrote the offer on the house. So, but this is the spuds. This is what the seller gets to fill out. And a lot of times, I always give a copy of this thing to the seller up front when we're doing the listing. I have them fill it out beforehand, and I put it into the Documents tab on the MLS to specifically let the downstream buyer know, here's the spuds. If you have a problem with Gila monsters, don't write an offer on this house. Let's not go through the hassle of you writing an offer, us maybe turning down another offer that did not have a Gila monster problem. So you can really see how this benefits the seller to have it out there up front and the buyer to read it, and especially the buyer's agent to look for that document and send it over to the buyer at the same time you're writing up an offer and discuss everything on there, or anything on here a no-go. Technically, you do lose a little bit of time on that because if you have the 5 days, to say no to it, after something comes up. But it's a really good time to just go through there and go, oh wow, hey, they don't know how old the air conditioner is, and we don't know how old the air conditioner is. Maybe we'll have the inspector take a really good hard look at that so they can guess how old the air conditioner is. These are this is the purpose of this document. So this sort of wraps up disclosures. We covered the spuds. We covered insurance claims history. We covered the seller declaring whether or not they were a foreign seller. We covered the lead-based paint side of the house and affidavit of disclosure for the people living out in the counties, and what happens if there's any change there in escrow, if anything happens to the property. So next week on this, we're going to be covering warranties. All right? This is where the buyers and the sellers are both signing off on a lot of things, agreeing that certain situations are in place. So catch that on the next episode.